I guess that was one of the bigger lessons that I learned, and something that when I started teaching English was what I really wanted to impart is you should think of it as the more mistakes you make and the mistakes that are corrected, the faster you will learn. And that's something that I keep in mind. I think a lot of language acquisition is held back by mindset, a lot of it. And we can get into that a little later as well.
Hey there, it's me, Lydia May, a proud Canadian immigrant and a firm believer in the power of a positive mindset. I want to have honest conversations with successful immigrants about their stories, insights, and what it really takes to thrive in your new home. Get ready to warm up to Canada. Welcome to the Ice to Nice podcast. Well, hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know you're quite famous, probably among immigrants, especially in Ontario, because I know that you have been helping immigrants to build that confidence they really need when they speak English language. But if you don't mind, can you introduce yourself and tell a little bit more about your profession and what you do?
Well, my name is Melissa, and as of recently, I have been working a lot with newcomers to Canada and immigrants looking to come to Canada. My experience is primarily as an English teacher. I spent 8 years of my early career living in Bogota, Colombia. And now I'm in the process of resettling back in Canada because my husband and I are coming to live here, and my husband's Colombian. So that is sort of what got me into this industry and then in this community, and it's rewarding work that I love very much.
I know that you are not an immigrant, but as you said, so your husband is an immigrant, and I guess you can understand all of the struggles and people are going through, especially when English is not their first language. And of course, the biggest thing for I think every newcomer to Canada, and even those who are planning to come, oh, my English will never be perfect and it will never improve, and everybody will be noticing that I speak with an accent. So my question to you, just to start from the beginning, do you think that to have a perfect English is very important for a career success in Canada, or sometimes you can survive just with not so perfect English here?
That's a good question. I do think that when you're learning a language, you need to get comfortable with imperfection because that is the only way you learn. And that is an experience that I've had personally. So I'll tell you a little bit of a story. But when I moved to Colombia, I didn't speak Spanish at all. And I remember really wanting to learn. So it wasn't because the desire wasn't there. I really wanted to be able to speak to my colleagues and have conversations with friends. There were many times where I'd go to gatherings and my friends would all switch to Spanish and I didn't understand. So I remember that barrier being there. But I do think there was a little bit of delay in my actual learning of the language because of my need to be perfect all the time and a lot of limiting beliefs I had about my ability to learn languages. So I only was really made aware of that when another friend of mine moved to Colombia. Well, he became my friend when we were living there, and he was able to learn Spanish in 3 months. And I think the real difference between the two of us was his desire to connect with people, and he had zero insecurity at all about making mistakes or being corrected. And I think and he was also a very social person. Like he would get out there and meet new friends all the time. And that I tended to stay in my little bubble. So I guess that was one of the bigger lessons that I learned, and something that when I started teaching English was what I really wanted to impart is you should think of it as the more mistakes you make and the mistakes that are corrected, the faster you will learn. And that's something that I keep in mind. I think a lot of language acquisition is held back by mindset, a lot of it. And we can get into that a little later as well.
Awesome, Max. Thank you so much for sharing such a wonderful story. And I do agree with you. And I always tell that, like sometimes, like your English is enough, but a lot of people they're still trying to become even better, better, and better. And there is nothing wrong to becoming better, right? So, like, since you're already in Canada and you pass your IELTS, so like you
Mhm.
went to like some school like here, so still you're good with English, just some things, but they can be fixed on the way, right? As your friend in Colombia, when he was going out, he was making those mistakes, but then it comes when you need to be very confident, right? I remember myself, I was terrified when I was back in Russia and I applied for Boval college program. Then I needed to call them to ask if the payment like went through. And I was like so stressed. I was like, oh my God, they won't understand me. I won't understand them. So, and I'm a very confident person, but when it would come to English, like back then, I was terrified. So, where and how maybe like if you know some resources which help newcomers, like I know that you are that resource as well, but maybe like you can just highlight for our viewers what are the main things which help people to gain that confidence in Canada.
To gain the confidence. Well, what you're describing, having to speak up for the first time, sounds stressful. So maybe what I would say is just practice in a less stressful setting first before putting yourself out there in that way. I think rehearsal and repetition is underrated. I definitely, that's something I did a lot. I was really lucky when I was learning a new language myself. I had a one on one tutor. So I would bring her scenarios like that. Like, if I have to make a presentation, can we practice it together? And then you're not just practicing the language itself, but you're practicing how you'll stand, what your voice is going to sound like. I would say that's the main thing. Visualize and rehearse before putting yourself in a stressful situation. And you'll find that slowly you'll gain the confidence in all kinds of new situations.
Know what are the common mistakes like newcomers make in Canada, if you can name any.
I find depending on what your mother tongue is, different mistakes will come up. I taught English to a lot of Spanish speakers. One of the things I noticed in terms of just that I'll correct in my classes is the ed pronunciation in the past tense, which it can be very tricky. And even I wasn't really aware of it until I taught it, but the ed is pronounced in three different ways. So sometimes you fully pronounce it like the id, like started, and then sometimes it's the t sound, and sometimes it's just the d sound. So little things like that can be worked on and practiced. I would say, like, in terms of those, that's a grammatical mistake, but I would say in terms of language acquisition mistakes, one I already mentioned, which is not putting yourself out there enough, and not really having that communicative practice. And two, like when I would work with adults, another thing I noticed a lot is people had a lot of limiting beliefs about their ability to learn languages. And that's something I try to correct a lot. So when I first started teaching adults, I worked with the parents of the students because in Colombia, I started off with students and then I kind of fell in love with teaching adults. And that's kind of how I moved into what I'm doing now. But I remember them saying, like, oh, when you're a kid, you're just a sponge, you absorb everything. And, now that I'm an adult, like, I'm just not going to be able to learn at that same capacity. And I do think that that's a limiting belief because, of course, kids have less self consciousness. So they tend to just be parrots and repeat. But I don't think that's to say that adults are incapable of learning as fast because adults have other skills. Like they have the gift of analysis. Like you can really analyze language, compare it to your mother tongue, break down grammar, break down pronunciation. So that's, I think, an advantage adults have. So I would say, yeah,
But
limiting beliefs are one, and not putting yourself out there to practice enough would be the two mistakes I see.
this is awesome. I've never heard like somebody like, would say it in this like, way, because yes, like, usually like, people they blame. Well, I'm not so young anymore, right? But I,
Mm-hmm.
I I I always bring my example like, as well. Like when I was a child, I didn't have a teacher of English in my school, and then like, when I'm growing up, I never paid enough attention like for learning like a foreign language. And that's like when I was already like 26 or 27, I started like learning English from scratch. I was using a lot of like listening to different radios and podcasts, and then like watching a lot of movies like with English language. And that's why like I'm a huge believer that you need to surround yourself like with a lot of English language around you. Do you think this is true? Because I'm not a teacher of like English, but like I would like to hear your approach and your point of view on this.
Definitely. I think immersion is key. As much exposure you can have to a language as possible is ideal. I would say too, I consider it a huge benefit that I got to live in the country when I was learning the language. I think sometimes people, excuse me, they'll start learning the language before they've even moved. And in those ways I think you have to get a little bit creative in how you expose yourself. So I think with technology it's so amazing. We have podcasts, you can get live one-on-one tutors to practice who are living in your target country. There are just so many tools now to help you really have that immersive experience. But like you said, I do think it's key.
Awesome. And I was wondering because I know you have a lot of clients. Are you okay to share like some challenges your clients like coming to you with, like just like some common things?
Yeah. In the career coaching that I've done, I would say a lot of the things I work on with people have to do with communication and not necessarily language, but just how they're presenting themselves and their ideas. Little tweaks can really make a huge difference. One thing that I coach on a lot when you're in a job interview, I noticed that a lot of people will focus on this aspect of like I'm a really fast learner, and although I think being a fast learner is amazing, in the context of a job interview, you really want to have the mindset of like, what am I contributing and what can I bring to the table from the start? So just that quick mindset shift can change the tone of an entire interview. And then also going into the interview, understanding your listener and communicating the strengths and experiences and results that you've driven that are related to the job you're applying for. Those types of tips I think are super important. And again, they have nothing to do with your ability to speak a language perfectly. It's just really about how you're presenting yourself, your experiences, your ideas, your ability to tell a story, to tell the story about your career trajectory thus far. So, yeah, I think that would be the main thing I coach on one on one.
Do you also like advise people like how to communicate in English as well, or it's mainly about like career coaching as well?
So, before when I used to coach one on one, it was mainly English language that we focused on. Yeah, there were some communication and cultural aspects that we did, but the goal was to increase awareness of grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, giving them tools so that they could acquire language not just in our tutoring sessions but outside. So that was my main goal. I just wanted to help my students become more aware of their learning process so that even outside of classes with me, they would be able to pick things up and just kind of have a new lens to look at things through. And I worked mostly with to like intermediate right before advanced was a lot of my students. And then now I focus a lot more on career coaching, and it is less about language at that point and more about, well, how can I communicate my strengths? How can I properly sell my experience? I'd say that's what I coach the most on now.
I see. And I think like a lot of our viewers, they might ask this question. So if you could talk a little bit more about having an accent, because like very often people say, well, I have this accent and I wanna improve it. And some of the people say, no, you shouldn't do that. It's beautiful. But for example, in my case, I still have like a heavy accent. Of course, like, through the years, it became a little bit better, but also at some point I decided to go and see a speech therapist. And like, and I really loved like that experience because not like I wanted to get rid of my accent, and like, and sometimes like, people, and correct me even if I'm wrong, they don't understand that there is a difference between like having an accent and actually like being like when we pronounce wrong some sounds, when like it's very hard to understand like what a person actually means.
I think you've made a good distinction because often when I teach, we do always have a pronunciation element and we do like to draw attention to certain phonemes or like pen and pen are like quite subtle, but I think bringing attention to it is really helpful in a class setting. So yes, like I do think it's helpful to at some point understand like what the sounds that make up a language and the word stress, for example, like understanding in a sentence where you stress the word or stress the syllable can change the meaning completely. But I also don't think people should feel insecure about having an accent because an accent can just be like the musicality of how you speak. It can just be the intonation or your choice of words. Like accents can be really beautiful, and learning to understand different accents is part of what I teach as well, because we're not just listening to a standard American accent. Like there are all kinds of accents in English. So I think it's helpful, to answer your question, to study, listen to different accents, get familiar with them, and then also like be aware of elements of pronunciation. Like that was one of the examples I brought up at the beginning, like the ED, just studying the ED pronunciation, that sometimes it's a T and sometimes it's a D and sometimes it's an id. What makes that difference? Yeah, I like a lot of my students come to me at an upper intermediate level, mainly wanting to focus on that. Their main goal is accent reduction, but I wouldn't say it's reducing their accent. It's just more helping them be aware of different elements of pronunciation and making them better note takers. Like when they hear new vocabulary, new sentences, they know like, oh, I heard the stress at the beginning of the sentence, or I heard the stress on this word. I find that super helpful.
No, that's great. So, like, can you share any success story that some of nobody who would come to you, like, with maybe not the greatest level of English, but then they also were looking for a career advice, and then just they succeeded in Canada.
Yeah, my favorite stories are always just I would coach a lot of professionals. So if I'm telling you a story based on my English teaching, when they would tell me that they felt more comfortable speaking up in meetings or that they felt comfortable enough to give a presentation in English, that to me was a huge win. And then in terms of career coaching, when someone just feels prepared to do their job interview, they're like, I nailed it. It went perfectly. Thank you so much for your support. Again, I think being able to rehearse things in advance before you're in a high stress situation helps so much. And that's why I just love the one on one coaching medium so much, because it creates a safe space for people to practice and then go out in the world and use those skills. I just really want people to feel comfortable with me and know that it's a safe space and create an environment where we can grow and learn. And to me, that's the main aim always.
Yes, and I'm wondering as well, so, and maybe it's a little bit like a personal question, but like, for example, with your husband, right? So, like at some point, he was brand new, to Canada. So, I was
Mm-hmm.
wondering if you have helped him a lot with his English as well, or like he was lucky enough that even when he met you, he had already a good level of English.
Yeah, actually, his English is amazing. He is like upper media advanced level. He was really shy about it at the beginning. Even when we first started dating, I didn't know his English was as good as it was because he just didn't want to speak it. So, but then when he finally did, I was like, I have no idea why we didn't speak in English before. Your English is great. But he definitely had a few words. Like he told me the most difficult word for him to pronounce in English is the word girlfriend. So,
Oh.
like because of the IR, the Earl, like that was the hardest word for him to pronounce. And there have been a couple things like I think being in a relationship with me that I'll hear and correct him on because he asks to be corrected. And I think he says he appreciates it. It helps him a lot.
And also, I'm curious, like, what was your decision to go to Colombia? Like, and just like, why did you pick Colombia? And also, what was very different for you being there in comparison with Canada? And then after Colombia, if you were happy to return back to Canada.
The story of how I went to Colombia is an interesting one. I had a very good Colombian friend in school, and I was very shy. I wasn't really socializing much. I went to Concordia in Montreal, and I was taking political science at the time. This was before I switched my major to English literature, but I was studying political science. And this lovely girl from one of my classes approached me and said, I know that you're in another one of my classes. And honestly, I had blinders on when I was at school. I wasn't really aware, but she approached me and was super friendly. And she's like, in our political philosophy class, I really like what you said, and I think we could study together. And so we made a little study group, and through her I met a lot of new friends, and to this day I'm so grateful that she approached me that day, and I don't know what drew her to me, but it really set me on a completely new path. And then she is Colombian, but her whole family's in Canada now. They're all Canadian citizens. And there was a point where she was going back to Colombia, and she was working at a school there, and she posted something on Facebook like, we're looking for English teachers. And that was something I was kind of interested in at the time. So I wrote to her saying that I was interested and got the interview. It was supposed to be a 6-week summer camp. And then I loved it so much there. I loved her family so much. Like, they really welcomed me like a second daughter. So I ended up staying, it was supposed to be a year, and then it turned into 2 years, and then it turned into 8 years. It's just, you really start to fall in love with, well, I think there was a lot of elements that made me fall in love with Colombia, but it really is a beautiful culture, a beautiful country. I had amazing friends, and I was very loved and felt it. So yeah, I ended up staying a long time, and then I met my husband, and then it became like, well, where do we as a couple want to settle? And then the conversation came up that, maybe we would end up back in Canada.
I see. But during the time of when you were in Colombia, did you miss Canada a lot or not so much?
I was lucky that I got to go back at Christmas. So I would, like, as a teacher, you get a lot of breaks. So I would go back in the summer and at Christmas. So I didn't really have a chance to get too homesick. And because I was treated like family, I never felt lonely there. Like, I had really amazing friends, and I lived on campus, so I was always around people, and I ended up adopting a little dog. And so, yeah, I
Oh, that's so
just
cute.
started feeling very, very at home there.
I see. And then, of course, like when you came to Canada, like, you were happy, like to be home. But then you
Yeah,
gained
and
this
I just felt
international experience.
Yeah, and I just felt so happy to be able to share that with my family. I would come back with gifts from Colombia and stories from Colombia, and I think being in Colombia helped me grow a lot as a person. I think it made me warmer. I think it made me, like, just to give you an example, when I first arrived, like, Colombia, they're very like huggy and touchy, and like that's part of their culture. And so, like, even just walking into work in the morning, the expectation is like you greet every single person with a kiss on the cheek. And I like barely even hug my
Yeah,
family.
yeah,
Like, I'm not comfortable with that.
yeah.
And slowly, I not only started to get comfortable, but I also started to appreciate it. Like, I like that people really make an effort to have these close bonds with not just their family and friends, but like coworkers. It just creates a different kind of work atmosphere that I really appreciated. So I just, like, you and I have talked about this, like, you kind of take certain elements from your country and elements from the new country you're living in, and then you can kind of pick and choose what resonates the most with you.
You spent so much time in Colombia, right? And and now I guess, as you mentioned, like this is experience that helps you actually to relate what immigrants are going through. And how people find you? Do they find you through LinkedIn? How people basically meet you? Like if they need some help.
Well, mainly now, I LinkedIn is the best way to contact me, but I'm mainly doing career coaching with immigration.ca. And I also have a podcast, Migrate Canada with immigration.ca, where we interview newcomers. And basically, I've kind of taken my love of language teaching and expanded that into other elements of coaching because, like you, I'm also very passionate about mindsets and ways to become more resilient and how to overcome obstacles. A lot of things which I discovered through language teaching, but yeah, it's expanded to this whole other world. And being able to speak to so many newcomers as well, I'm just so inspired by them because I do think newcomers have a level of resilience that maybe the average person wouldn't have because they have had the experience of having to completely start over, readapt, sometimes with no community, starting your career from scratch. So, in any way that I can help, support, provide resources to that community, that's what I try to do. So mainly through the podcast Migrate Canada, through LinkedIn is another great way to get in contact, but that's mainly where I exist on the internet.
So, but now I'm circling back, I was wondering, what would be your final advice to all newcomers, or maybe those who wanna come, who are struggling with that confidence in speaking in English in Canada, or even prior than they came to Canada? What would be your best advice and where they should look for help?
For me personally, and the experience I had teaching, if you can, even for a short time, get a one on one tutor, I think it's so helpful because if you do it for a short time, they can identify certain areas where you can work on a little bit more. They can teach you tricks that, so when you're out in the world and you hear a new vocabulary word, you know how to make note of it, how to write it down, like different ways to remember it, different ways to repeat it. And then I would say really just slowly open your circle of comfort. Like maybe if you're a shy person, don't immediately put yourself up onto a stage, but like slowly open yourself up to that. Like maybe practice a speech with a close, trusted friend or your tutor, or like if you're thinking of speaking up in a meeting and giving your opinion and that's something that wasn't comfortable for you before, like rehearse it a little bit in advance just so that you can visualize what it'll feel like before you kind of jump right in. But everything is a process. And I think it's just a matter of like opening your circle of comfort little by little by little. And you don't necessarily have to jump off the deep end right away. Like you can create that comfort for yourself, just as long as you know what your ultimate goal is.
I see. And this is a great advice. And thank you so much for sharing. And as I said, I really like your voice, your personality. I think everybody who meets you, they will benefit, for sure. And maybe they will can get some of the confidence as well. And maybe they will stop thinking that they need perfect English in order to survive in Canada. That it can be just okay with a little bit of tweaks there, and they will be fine. Thank you so much for coming again.
All right. Thanks so much for having me. It was great being here.